Now we move on to Deniz Appelbaum from Montclair State University.
Thank you, Michael. And I want to thank the WCARS committee, Miklos and others for agreeing to allow us to present our research. I'm here on behalf of my colleagues, Daniel Lombardi and Jenna Scipior of Villanova University. And the title of our research paper is The COVID-19 Black Swan, Auditing Uncertainty. So we do acknowledge in the paper that Taleb he actually says that the pandemic was not a black swan event. However, we argue that because for most businesses and most individuals, black swan, the COVID was actually a black swan. This is a paper about auditing uncertainty, which we feel, given the nature of the COVID and 10 years ago, the financial crisis, and before that, the dot-com bust in the early 2000s, we feel that it's time for us as an audit profession to consider auditing uncertainty as an extension or addition to the typical audit procedures we undertake. So the COVID-19 was an unexpected and rare outlier event with enormous impact and results and consequences that we still are undergoing. So it was a black swan in the sense that we had no idea that it would last this long, but have such a great impact on society. For example, there's been other pandemics and other outbreaks, for example, the Ebola outbreak before the COVID-19, which did not have the great impact that the COVID-19 has had. So, this rare and anticipated event like COVID-19 causes great uncertainty for society, for businesses, and for their auditors. So we discuss and we extend prior research from the paper that Alex and Miklos and I wrote about, well, several of them actually, about how audit analytical applications need to evolve given this uncertainty in society. We need to consider uncertainty as part of the inherent risk assessment process. And then once we're in that situation, how do our audit procedures need to incorporate this uncertainty in the data, uncertainty in the circumstances of the business? And this involves, looking beyond our traditional deterministic statistical methods and realizing that the data may not be very predictive or very informative. And we have to go more at a random probability type mindset. So we have to use more prescriptive analytics, more stochastic models, and big data outside the typical financial data. So auditing uncertainty is relevant to academics, practitioners, and regulators of the audit profession beyond the COVID-19 issue. So what is uncertainty exactly? So we don't want to assume that we know what it means. It's really the epistemic situations involving perfect or unknown information. It applies to predictions of future events, to physical measurements that have already been made, or to the unknown. It arises in partially observable and or stochastic environments and is due to ignorance, indolence, or both. Not very complimentary, right? It arises in a number of fields, including insurance, philosophy, physics, statistics, finance. So the finance industry acknowledges that uncertainty is a huge part of our analysis every day of market behavior and performance of stocks and derivatives, psychology, sociology, engineering, metrology, meteorology, ecology, and information science. So almost every area of society is impacted by uncertainty. So what's happened with COVID-19 is business is not as usual. So business changed drastically, and in many senses, we are still trying to unravel the impact of COVID-19, which has affected the audit procedures that we're undertaking or undergoing at the time the pandemic broke out, and it also is impacting the audit procedures now in terms of inherent risk assessment, looking at to see where business is going, what are the risks to the business given the pandemic environment, and also once we're in the pandemic now, how has it impacted our audit procedures and regular business procedures? And we have to acknowledge that not all events are directly observable. And this is a key tenet, our feature of the audit of uncertainty, that often you're just given breadcrumbs or indicators, and we need to extrapolate from those indicators or infer from those indicators what exactly is happening. And also, which is true of these kind of events, is that the status of yesterday no longer holds true today. And this goes to the paper written by Professor Gray and Professor Alice recently in Jeddah. They discuss, the procedures and undertaking the business given the pandemic. And now we reference quite extensively Taleb's research. I mean, he's written this book on black swan, but he also has numerous other papers. Most of his papers discuss why traditional statistics do not apply to uncertainties or black swan events. So he defines a black swan event as being an outlier. So this is a very familiar term to most of us as auditors. And so we do black swan type of analysis already with exceptional exceptions and outlier analysis and clustering. So these outliers lie outside the realm of regular expectations because nothing in the past can convincingly point to its possibility. Now, this is where Taleb, he has come out and said, well, COVID-19 is not really a black swan because we had indicators. But most of society had no clue that it was happening. So I can tell you anecdotally, my father is a day trader, and he indicated to me in January that there would be an event happening. He calculated this based on the analysis he runs all the time. Basically, he trades a lot in the Asian market, so he was very much on to what was going on. But for most businesses, they had no clue. They had no indication that this was occurring, that there was an outbreak in the late fall, early to 2020. So, and second, it carries an extreme impact. And this is where it could really be considered a black swan because no one had an idea that it would be so widespread and going on for so long. And third, in spite of the outlier status, human nature makes us try to explain it after the facts. We've seen this occurring now with all the discussion of the market or the research center, or we're trying to explain what it is, and we're trying to make it explainable and predictable for the future. So we take the position in the paper that despite Taleb's position of the black swan not being applicable to COVID-19, we argue that for many businesses and society in general, the COVID-19 pandemic was and is a black swan event. Most businesses, did not have an idea it was going to be happening. And certainly the auditors didn't seem to have indicators or assuming that would be happening. So business is uncertain in general, and the auditor needs to start regarding this uncertainty in the audit process. So I like this, the audit of uncertainty requires the use of, for example, random stochastic processes similar to what Fama proposes in 1995. And every audit should consider the risk of various improbable events and their potential impact. So this is considered part of the inherent risk assessment process, where we try to analyze using stochastic models. What are the probabilities of certain types of events occurring? And we may want to do this more in some industries than others. And everything is connected in ways that are unknown. And this is what is a key feature of many of these processes. And the reason why we want to consider these type of approaches is because the data that was available to auditors at the time of the pandemic, before the pandemic and after the pandemic began, really was very uninformative because it was related to previous, except for the fact that maybe we could extrapolate improbable events and unknown connections. So I like to illustrate the situation, and this is Taleb's Thanksgiving turkey. So we have this gorgeous looking turkey here. He lives on a farm. He's been fed for 1,000 days. And basically the traditional analysts tell him that things are looking great. He has a wonderful food supply. He's run of all the female turkeys on the farm. He's very, very happy. After all, the moving rolling average and trends of the preceding 1,000 days confirm this. What could possibly go wrong, right? However, he has no knowledge that there is such a thing called Thanksgiving. And suddenly one day before Thanksgiving, the turkey is abruptly slaughtered and becomes your Thanksgiving dinner. That's our gorgeous turkey now served up on a platter. Also very interesting is that the black swan, which is a very rare, beautiful bird. So most people did not know it existed for many years until they saw it in Australia, and it also exists in North Korea and other countries in the Asian hemisphere. And it's revered, and usually people try to appreciate the beauty of the black swan. It's a very gorgeous bird. However, the black swan has experienced its own black swan event. The North Koreans are suddenly being told to eat black swans amid their food crisis. And this is a recent occurrence. The North Korean state agency has declared black swan meat an exceptional health food. So the black swans are experiencing their own black swan right now. So it's very sad. But so I just threw that in there because I thought it was very interesting. So basically in our paper, we talk about the audit of uncertainty extends the theories proposed by Taleb and Fama, and also the discussion of the prescriptive models that we should use by my paper earlier with Alex Kogan and Miklos, and how the inherent business risk assessment must evolve from that of determinism to one that includes randomness and stochastic methods. Just like stock and derivatives and finance, accounting measures may lend themselves to a stochastic perspective when the sequence of prior events cannot accurately inform the prediction of future performances. And anecdotally, when we were conducting research on interviewing audit firm partners for another paper with my co-authors, the firm partners were mentioning that they had challenges trying to understand what was happening with the companies, given they were aware that the previous data was really uninformative and not very predictive in that situation. So we have to use more prescriptive and stochastic methods during the engagement and for inherent risk assessment when we're looking at auditing uncertainty. So there has been some research, but not much, using stochastic approaches, mainly in the area of sampling, earlier on in the 70s, 80s, primarily, and a little bit in the 90s, and internal controls, but not for analytical procedures and risk assessment beyond the two papers that Miklos and Alex and I wrote. So what's key to this is that we're looking at more current data, although we can infer some probabilities given the previous data. So basically, but it's used differently. It's not used for prediction, but for inference and to understand what is the hidden currents in this situation and currents in society that can be informed by the indicators. So what exactly is the audit of uncertainty? So typically when we audit, and most statistics is based on the idea of having a fat center, and with the tails being very thin in terms of probability, that is almost impossible. Whereas audit of uncertainty looks at the fact or the idea that those thin tails are no longer thin, they're very thick. And so it requires a different kind of analysis because we have to unpack the thin tails and realize that actually the probability is becoming higher or is already high. So this is a quick slide here of some of the tenets or propositions made by Taleb in his book. All the references he makes to what the situation that auditors or business analysts may find themselves in this environment. So we now take the typical audit engagement process as outlined by Cushing and Lobica in 1986, and we expand it and look to see where, and actually we're extending the research that was provided by our earlier papers. For example, here in the JR paper, we proposed and we showed the way the research has occurred in our field in the area of prescriptive research and where it could be provided or more research is needed. We also provided a listing of prescriptive methodologies, and then also where in the audit process we find that it could be proposed to be used. So the main types of methodologies that we discuss in our paper, the ones in the white are more we see for the risk assessment and engagement process, where the auditor is trying to explore and find what the general risk is for the client or the business. And the ones in the light orange are more what would be undertaken after the engagement is started, more in the other procedures or other steps. Although the other top ones are not precluded from being included later in the audit engagement. So first we're going to discuss Bayesian networks, which basically allows us to infer unobserved variables, learn about the parameters and their maximum likelihood or posterior probabilities, and to understand the structure of the process and interdependencies. So the idea is that we're using Bayes' theorem, where the probability of an event is obtained based on the prior knowledge of conditions that may or may not have contributed to its occurrence. And also conversely, the auditor may want to consider the areas where we don't see much inference. Maybe the auditor should look at the opposite situation of the Bayesian network results. We also propose the auditor may want to consider random walk theory, as proposed by Fama in 1995. This describes the flows of random or stochastic processes and illustrates a path that consists of sequential random steps that are started initially with equal probabilities and randomness and weights. And basically, it's always like flipping the dice in terms of the pathway that happens. And you see this illustration on the top, it's very random, and it's used very heavily in the finance research. We also have the hidden Markov models, which are also very heavily used in finance. And I call this the breadcrumb models, where basically the system being modeled is a Markov process X with undiscovered hidden conditions and signals, and assumes that there is no directly observable process Y, which is dependent on the status of X. X is observed, or the breadcrumbs, via signals inferred from these exogenous data about Y. And the objective is to learn about X by observing Y, or the breadcrumbs. And it's used quite heavily already in tech, using, we see it could be used in, text data, GPS data, weather, numerical, or other types of big data. An extension of this would be the Monte Carlo models, also used quite extensively in risk-adverse industries. And basically, Monte Carlo models, due to the law of large numbers, can approximate the integrals from random variables by taking a sample mean of these variables. And they sample from a probability distribution for each of these variables to produce many outcomes. And then they are assessed to the likelihood of occurring. And this is an iterative process. And there is a very unique methodology generated based on black swan events called the Swan axiom of probabilities from 2010. And basically proposes a system which allocates more weight to the features of such events by utilizing this axiom of probability measurements that's very subjective. Now going on to a more familiar methodology that many of us work with is clustering. And we referenced the Barron's paper in 2019. And basically it's the idea that objects may be similar to one another, and sometimes in ways that we cannot directly see, or by variables that we would not naturally assume them to be correlated. And so it can be attention gathering, exploratory, and the actual, and the actual algorithm type of clustering would be depending on the kind of data that you have and how much data you have, and that type of thing. And the idea is that it's the birds of a feather flock together. So the black swans of a certain feather flock together. And of course, we have Professor Isa's famous paper from 2013, part of his dissertation, and also now part of one of the apps on IDEA called Exceptional Exceptions. And the idea is it's basically an optimization model for analyzing large volumes of data. And the idea is that if we're, basically we may have lots of outliers we're dealing with, how do we prioritize those exceptions? And the idea is that some are more exceptional than others, and truly more graver than others. And this provides a framework for now analyzing, trying to reduce the workload and prioritize those results. We've talked a lot already about in this conference already about process mining. This also provides unknown or unobserved types of transactions that might be occurring in a firm, allows you to see where exactly there are deviations in the pathways of transactions, which you may not be able to see looking at a table. Also very helpful for auditors, particularly in this type of pandemic environment. We would anticipate there might be more deviations or curtailing of controls because of the activities, or there might be an increase in controls. And we also have, which is used quite heavily in forensic analysis, network analysis. So this could be across modalities, across platforms, across businesses, across social media, looking to see the unforeseen or untoward connections between individuals, companies, transactions, and allows us to visualize this in a way that may not be able to easily be seen looking at traditional tables and other extractions. So just to break down how the audit process would change, or how we would enhance the current audit engagement process, we propose, and this is a very short summary of what we do in the paper, and we argue that the potential client must engage or accept the audit firm. And under COVID-19, the step for the auditor of engagement and client acceptance increases in importance. So a lot of these methodologies would occur in this step. So, we see statistics of improbable conditions are hugely important, as is the initial assessment of inherent business risk. and we propose a few of the methodologies like we just discussed. In the second phase, the risk assessment, inherent business risk assessment increases in importance, reinforcing additional applications of fat tail statistical analyses. Again, the very similar types of processes we might want to undertake at this point as well. And the third phase entails increased use of technology, evidence collection. So this assumes that the auditor is remote, for example, and largely. So we may be using social media, video, audio files, drones, Google Glasses for inventory observations of asset assessment processes, and we suggest process mining, network analysis, clustering, in addition to other typical methods. And the fourth phase review may go back to the inherent risk phase and review all of those earlier assessments and look at the same improbable methodologies and see whether it truly is optimal or probable and reassess those evaluations. And then finally, the fifth phase of reporting may require use of different technologies, be more interactive. Basically we see that we envision that, given those types of analyses, we may want to change how we report and discuss these reports and the findings. So basically we are sounding the alarm for the audit profession in this paper. We feel that, I know that our earlier papers did reference the prescriptive techniques, but this paper focuses exclusively on the prescriptive and the optimization techniques. And we feel that similar to finance, insurance, energy, and other risk adverse industries, which we truly are as auditors and accountants, we're risk adverse. Audit research and the audit profession should consider stochastic methods alongside, not eliminating, but along with the more traditional techniques for inherent business risk assessment and analytical procedures. Whether it be a pandemic, a terrorist attack, or other event, these previously unanticipated black swan events could be anticipated to a greater degree, perhaps, with the deployment of stochastic analytical techniques. So we extend the broad argument that Taleb made in many of his papers that black swan events cannot be predicted utilizing traditional statistics favored by the auditing profession to date. Instead, we have to avail ourselves of more of the probability models and stochastic methodologies available to gain a better understanding of black swan events and when they may occur and what their impact could be on the business. Now, there are some areas of issues for audited risk assessment due to black swan events. So what are the metrics for a black swan event for the different stochastic approaches? When is it a cause for alarm? So we have this whole benchmarking that needs to occur. How to determine the entity's level of exposure to the black swan and its effects? Again, a benchmarking issue. What is the auditor's level of confidence in her knowledge of the analytics and the data? How to explain her findings to management to gain acceptance? So this is another big issue. Looking at probability models. Well, how reliable are these models? And or how probable are they? So how probable are the findings? So business people would be reluctant to change their business practices midstream based on improbability model perhaps. How can the auditor gain a more reasoned imagination? So we discussed this in the paper that auditors and the auditor profession as in general needs to have a more reasoned imagination or more imagineering to be able to apply these types of methodologies that is required for stochastic risk assessment. So to what degree should the auditor gain or expand the audit to a more horizontal or environmental scan to identify threats and opportunities? So what is reasonable in terms of how far wide do we look at the data that's available? How an entity reduces exposure to black swan event affordably if they agree that the probability methods are indeed accurate. How can it reduce that risk without being, it goes back to the old effectiveness and efficiency of control findings. Yes, we can have controls, to nth degree, but it wouldn't be very efficient, right? So it'd be very effective, but not very efficient. It'd be very costly. So we have the same situation here. We can imagine you're an infinite number of probabilities. So what is it affordable, or what stance should the auditor take and the business take in terms of mitigating the impact of the black swan? And what are the regulatory and legal ramifications for audit decisions and recommendations that are grounded on stochastic methods? So we have trouble enough getting our audit profession and the regulators to accept other technologies. So what would happen here? But I would argue that since it's used heavily in the oil industry and in the weather industry and meteorology and in the in the finance industry already, it should be a natural in some, particularly in some areas of business. So just a closing thought, many statisticians were working on trying to predict, the variability and predict what was going to happen with COVID-19. And a young data scientist, a student basically, deployed several stochastic analytical techniques and big data to build a model that predicted COVID-19 deaths, which was far more accurate than the models deployed by leading statisticians using traditional techniques. So though it was not perfect, and this was an article reference, an article in Business Week, the model vastly outperformed traditional models using traditional data sources. So we argue if auditors are to execute more accurate models and gain additional insights, particularly during a black swan-like event, or to predict or have a better probability model regarding black swan type events, prescriptive and stochastic techniques and big data are essential. So with that, we are done with the paper, and I thank you for your time.